today I want to complete the national or domestic part of the programmatic argument. I say domestic or national because next week I intend to extend this programmatic argument into a discussion of globalization and its alternative forms, and that leaves us only a couple of classes in April to discuss the general ideas of the course, both normative and explanatory. And all of you should have received by now the writing assignment for the students enrolled in the course. And I just want to say that the writing assignment should be approached as an opportunity to develop your position and your voice. It couldn't be more open-ended than it is. And I do not have in my mind a conception of what a good response looks like. If I had such a conception, I would state it. I would much rather be surprised, both with respect to content and with respect to forms. My one request is this, that no one asks me whether this or that topic is a good topic. Answering such a question subverts the point of the whole exercise. You're the ones who have to determine what is a good topic and a good method. Any question about the final paper assignment? Yes.
Citation format or citation in general?
Excuse me?
Citations format?
No, there's no canonical citation format, whatever. First of all, it's not a research paper. It's a thought paper. You can do whatever research you want, using both materials of the course and any other materials. But it's not primarily a research paper. It's not intended to be. It's an argument with a beginning, a middle, and an end, which should stand on its own. Any other questions about the final assignment? There's a minimum of 15 pages, but there's no maximum. And I do commit to read whatever you present me with. I found in my experience that sometimes the very longest papers are terrific and reveal extraordinary exertion and intensity. I have no reason to suppress that. So that's the story. Any other question? Comment? Oh yes, and of course, it's entirely permitted to discuss your paper or your ideas with one another or with anyone else, within or outside the course. The only restraint on such collaboration is the normal restraint in intellectual life, that of the final product, you should be able to say in good faith that it is largely the expression of your own mind. In other words, you shouldn't present something written by someone else, but short of that, almost anything goes.
Do you provide feedback on the
Excuse me?
Do you provide feedback on the papers?
I can't really do that. I mean, if there is a particular paper you want to discuss with me later, in the summer or the fall next year, I'm happy to do that. But with 4 courses and with many papers, there's no way I can write a paper that's just not feasible. So the programmatic argument, which is intended, as you've seen during the semester, to fill a vacuum. it's futile to keep discussing the lack of alternatives if there's no detailed example before us of an alternative, of a structural alternative, an alternative with institutional content. And I thought that the most useful thing I could do, given the almost universal skepticism about alternatives, is to provide a forceful, detailed example from my standpoint, given my ideas, of what such an alternative would look like. Now, of course, or might look like, because there could be examples given in radically different directions. And of course, the particular example is animated by the normative ideas and the conceptions of the distinction between the left and the right, and the assumptions about structure and structural change, which I briefly discussed at the beginning of the course, and to which I will return in the final weeks. So the particular alternative that I have been attempting to describe, to outline, and to discuss with you has four main axes. The first is the democratization of the market order. The construction of the base, and especially the institutional base, for socially inclusive economic growth. And in particular, given the nature of the present most advanced practice of production, of a knowledge economy for the many that would succeed and supplant what we have, a knowledge economy for the few. I then explored what seemed to me to be the three main focal points of a progressive political economy. The relation of the vanguard of production to the rest of the production system, the relation of labor to capital, and the relation of finance to production or to the real economy. Now, of course, most of the discussion between the left and the right, such as it exists in the world, is not about any of these subjects, but about the contours of and the dimension of compensatory redistribution. And the premise of this existing discussion is that the market is what it is. There's one market order, and it is a tremendous machine for generating wealth, but also for creating inequality. And therefore we must come after the fact, after the market has done its magic of creating wealth, and attenuate its inequalities through compensatory redistribution. And at least since the end of the Second World War, so that's like 80 years ago, that topic describes most of the focus of the programmatic debate in political economy. So in addition to exploring those 3 points, I've also outlined the position that one would take with respect to this subsidiary but important matter of compensatory redistribution, and how a position with respect to compensatory redistribution can be reconciled with an orientation that privileges the institutional reconstruction of the market order. Now, the second main focal point, the second main axis of the programmatic discussion has been the deepening of democracy. The counterpart to the democratization of the market order is the deepening of democracy. And in particular, the creation of what I have called a high-energy democracy by all the tests that I enumerated, high energy by all of those tests. By contrast to what exists today in the whole world, which are weak or flawed democracies. Some more flawed and some weaker than others. But none of them exemplifying what I described as a high energy democracy. The third axis, to which I will return today, is the self-organization of civil society outside the market and outside the state. On the assumption that a disorganized society cannot generate alternatives or act on them. And the fourth axis is the transformation of education and of culture. Therefore, in general, consciousness. And in this final terrain of education, there's a meeting between the problem of institutions and the problem of consciousness. It's not enough to change the institutional structure of the market and of the state. It is also necessary to change the ideological assumptions with which these institutional arrangements are associated. After all, no institutional order can be separated from the ideas that animate it. Our understanding of our interests and of our ideals is always nailed to the cross of the practices and the institutions that represent them in fact. And the law is the site of this crucifixion. Because it is in the law that this encounter of the institutions with the interests and ideals appears in detailed form, not just as a series of abstractions like socialism or capitalism or the command economy or the market economy. Now let me return today in this class to the last two axes in this agenda: the organization of civil society and the transformation of education and of culture. Before addressing, toward the end of the class, the question of the social base of such an alternative. So I said a moment ago, a disorganized society cannot generate alternatives or act on them. Organization, we all say, is power. But how is civil society to be organized? Self-organized outside the state and outside the market. In the orthodox prevailing classical liberal theories of civil society, the existing apparatus of private law, of contract law, of property law, of the law of associations and corporations, is treated as if it were a natural language with infinite elasticity, in which any thought about cooperation could be formulated, just as supposedly we can formulate any idea in any natural language. But this claim, in fact, I want to argue is false. The self-organization of civil society outside the state requires particular institutional innovations. Now, to be sure, the most important incentives to the organization or the self-organization of civil society lie in the economy on the one hand and in politics on the other. The knowledge economy for the many that I described earlier in the course depends on an elevation of the level of reciprocal trust and of discretionary initiative allowed and required of all participants in the process of production. For example, one of the characteristics of advanced manufacture as it spreads through the economy and society is the promotion of regimes of cooperative competition within firms, outside of firms, and among firms that fluidly mix together in the same domains cooperation and competition rather than allocating cooperation and competition to distinct domains. The legal expression of that is the assent, the predominance of a different kind of contractual relationship. The relational contract, by opposition to the bilateral executory promise, the arm's length, fully articulated deal for an instantaneous exchange of performances at some moment in the future. The relational contract is an incomplete contract designed to generate a series of exchanges and focus not so much on these exchanges, on the particular exchanges, but on the vitality, on the fecundity of the relationship itself. The established form of the market order assumes a low-trust economy. As I said earlier, referring to the views of the classic European social theorists like Max Weber, the generalization of a low level of trust among strangers. But this economy of the inclusive knowledge economy presupposes a high trust, or a higher trust at least, which is essential to its operation. On the other hand, a high-energy democracy, the deepened democracy that I described through those cumulative institutional innovations that we discussed last week, also presupposes an accumulation of social capital, or points to it. The assumption there is that the ultimate or strongest basis of social cohesion in contemporary societies is purposeful collaboration. People from different backgrounds, from different walks of life, doing things together for a common purpose. So when I speak about the arrangements and practices within civil society that would help organize it or lift the degree of association, contribute to the disposition to cooperate, accumulate social capital, I recognize that all of these initiatives internal to civil society are much less important than the incentives to cooperation that come from outside, from the economy and from politics. If economic and political life are organized as they now are, low energy democracies, low trust market orders, this reality will drag down independent civil society and overshadow all of the initiatives that we can take within it to accumulate social capital. Now, I want to invoke once again two such initiatives within civil society. That contribute to the development of what you would call the higher forms of cooperation. One way of describing what the higher forms of cooperation are in general, saying what their point is their point is to create the cooperative regime, the form of cooperation in politics and in the economy that is best able to reconcile the imperatives of cooperation and innovation. Every innovation, technological, organizational, institutional, or conceptual, requires cooperation. It requires cooperation, if not to produce it, to invent it, certainly to implement it. But at the same time, every innovation threatens the established cooperative regime. Because every time there's an innovation of any of these kinds, it raises the question, who will benefit? Or who will be hurt? Who will be harmed by the innovation? So innovation excites disturbance and conflict. Under what way of organizing cooperation, under what cooperative regime can the form of cooperation be most hospitable to the repeated practice of innovation? So then there were two particular sets of innovations of very different kinds to which I pointed last week in our brief discussion of this theme. The first is a transformation in the method of the provision of public services or public goods. Now, this is a very important theme in conventional politics, the electoral politics of the existing low-energy democracies, and especially in the rich countries. The quality and provision of public goods, of public services. And I said then that what now exists in the world still is what you would call administrative Fordism. By allusion, by comparison to industrial Fordism. Industrial Fordism is mass production. And administrative Fordism is the provision of standardized, low-quality public services by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. Instead of goods and services, tangible goods and services, the services created by the state. And when I say of low quality, I mean just of lower quality than the equivalent services that can be bought on the market by someone who has money. Now, it's a general premise that the most accessible alternative to these Fordist public services is the privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms. So a little bit of low-quality, standardized public services mixed together with some privatization. But there's another alternative which has, I think, much more promise and will become increasingly important in the 21st century. The state provides a universal floor of universally accessible basic public services, which are inevitably standardized. And the state operates at the same time at the ceiling in the invention, development, and funding of the most complex and costliest public services. But in the broad middle zone between the floor and the ceiling, the state partners with independent civil society. An independent civil society that acts through some form of cooperative organization, not necessarily cooperatives in the strict sense, to partner with the state in the experimentalist provision of public services. And the basic idea there is that this partnership between the state and civil society is at the same time the most promising way to enhance the quality of the services and the most powerful incentive to the self-organization of civil society outside the market and outside the state. So the creation of public services, or the provision of public services is in a sense the activity by which civil society creates its own future. Because that's what public services are. In health and education and security, they're the creation of a future of the same civil society. So the activity that's being prefigured here is the participation of civil society in the creation of its own future. An enhanced form of agency. And this experimentalist transformation, this substitution of administrative Fordism, could be taken as an example of a larger theme. The larger theme is the conversion of the state to an experimentalist form of action. Now, take the concept of the rule of law, the simple concept of the rule of law. It's part of our conventional idea of the rule of law that the state either changes the rule universally for everyone and for all situations, or it doesn't change it. The state can't try things out. It can't say, before we adopt this or that procedure, we'll experiment in this form or that form. But of course, experimentation is ever more the life of the economy and is central to the knowledge economy. And especially to a knowledge economy for the many, a broad-based knowledge economy that rather than remaining insular, penetrates the entire production system. So what's happening is that there's an advance in the nature of the economy, in the nature of production. If not a knowledge economy for the many, at least an insular knowledge economy. Through these little worlds of experimentalism and accelerated innovation. But on the side of administration of the state, there's no real counterpart to that same advance. And this is then the imbalance that we would seek to redress by this form. Now, the second particular innovation that I invoked last week is in different ways more radical. Harder to conceive and to implement. And it could be summarized in a simple idea. The idea is that in a contemporary society, in these societies, treating as potential terrains for the advance of an experimentalist, inclusive knowledge economy and of a high-energy democracy, every able-bodied adult should have two positions. A position in the system of production or of skilling, of education of some kind, and a position in helping to take care of other people outside the boundaries of family selfishness. And therefore, in principle, through some form of social service that can be either voluntary or mandatory. And I mentioned then, as one of the many ways in which this idea could be instituted in contemporary societies, the notion that mandatory social service could be offered as an alternative to mandatory military service where mandatory military service exists. And in these countries that are large and very unequal and have different worlds within them, the youth exempted from military service would spend a year or two of their early lives and their early formation helping to build the country in another region of the country, working together with other fellow citizens from other classes, from other regions. So this idea exemplifies, embodies a couple of related, connected notions. First, the notion that money is not an adequate social cement, as the contemporary experience of European social democracy demonstrates. So, in one of these social democracies, the background historically was a high level of homogeneity, cultural, religious, linguistic, and even physical homogeneity. People who look alike, talk alike, feel alike, think alike. And against that background of homogeneity, then, the social democratic state, wedded to compensatory redistribution, increases social solidarity through money transfers designed to help people who are in need and to attenuate inequality. And in that context, it seemed that compensatory redistribution enhanced the cohesive effects of this socially and culturally homogeneous background. Then come migratory flows, outsiders, strangers who look different or worship different gods. And the erosion of the homogeneity then exposes the inadequacy of money. Money seemed to be a sufficient social cement so long as there was a high level of homogeneity. But as soon as the homogeneity is degraded by pluralism, by mixture, by miscegenation of any kind, the inadequacy of money becomes patent. And then we have to ask ourselves, what then is the basis of homogeneity? And the notion there is that the only adequate basis is direct involvement in other people's lives. The only adequate basis of social cohesion, and we can add the other element, which I mentioned before, of collaborative, purposeful action. Common purpose in action. People drawn from different walks of life, from different backgrounds, doing things together. So rather than thinking of cohesion or solidarity as a fixed quantity, as a fund on which we draw, we think of it as something that we can create by these forms. And we say, the cohesion that matters most is not the cohesion that we have inherited and that is based on our external similarities, but the cohesion that will result from common action. Now, of course, I think that this second set of innovations, the ones that have to do with social service, are much more difficult to accept, to implement, to flourish than the first set. The set about experimentalism in the action of the state, the administrative counterpart to the knowledge economy. So a higher degree of advance, a wider moral horizon than the practical goals that animate the first set of initiatives. Well, let me stop there and ask for your comments, questions, propositions before going further. Yes?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand the first proposal better, with,
The administrative counterpart to
with the state offering,
non-Fordism.
yeah, the state offering a floor, investing in a ceiling, and then partnering in the middle. I guess the analogy that sprung to mind was the current, like, healthcare system with Medicare at the bottom, the NIH making grants in the US, the NIH making grants to fund health investment, and then, I don't know, like tax breaks for paying for insurance in the middle. Is that a good way to think of it?
It could be. I mean, it obviously depends on the details, right? I mean, you're naturally thinking of it in an American context where much of whatever form of cooperation or social innovation exists is drawn from the so-called third sector, from the world of foundations, of nonprofits, and so forth, and their collaboration. And that, of course, is a very powerful source. In many societies, the churches have this role, in orphanages, in hospitals, and so forth. So this is the ancient historical form of this idea. We can imagine it expanded. And the question is, how do we expand it practically in particular circumstances?
Right, so like what would the expansion of those partnerships look like, I guess?
Well, so for example, in many countries, there's this discussion in education and schooling. And in the United States, the form of the charter schools and so forth. But that's just the American label for something that's being tried out all over the world. And you can imagine that not just in education, but in every field of public policy. I mean, take something that seems completely different from that, which is crime, violence. So there's two kinds of crime, basically. There's organized crime and there's episodic daily crime. In many countries, organized crime receives all the attention. But there's no country in which the main source of violence is organized crime. The main source of violence is disorganized. And this episodic crime in the streets, in the houses, and so forth. Now, these two kinds of crimes are fundamentally different nature. Because organized crime is a phenomenon of the weakness of the state. Organized crime is a parallel state. And one of the ways in which organized crime develops is by assuming functions of the state and receiving acceptance from the population, legitimacy, by providing what are in effect public services. And so then there's a war between the state and the parallel state. That's the world of organized crime. And there's no way of thinking of it as anything other than a war. It is a war in which the state wants to affirm its monopoly of violence against organized crime. by all the means available to it. Now, the second kind of crime is disorganized crime, this episodic daily crime, including violent crime, robberies, murders, rapes, and so forth. And this disorganized daily crime is an expression not of the weakness of the state, but of the disorganization of society. So, what do I mean by organization in this context of crime? So it has two sides. Transparency means when there's organization at the grassroots, down below, people are watching. They're watching what happens around them. And they're not only watching, but they're actually seeing, because that's what transparency means. And the other dimension is the dimension of responsibility, solidaristic responsibility. People feel engaged. Where there is a high level of grassroots organization, the level of episodic crime collapses dramatically. And so you take two countries that take Brazil and India. India is poorer than Brazil per capita. And almost as unequal as Brazil. But the level of episodic violent crime at the grassroots is much lower than it is in Brazil. Now, why? Because Indian society at the village level is highly organized. Not necessarily in associational forms that we would like caste organizations and so forth, sectarian forms that can be oppressive. But whether it's likable or not, the fact is that organization ends crime, episodic crime. So these two kinds of crime then create opportunities for each other. There's a dialectic, obviously. Organized crime by warring against the state, occupying the vacuum of the omission of the state, creates a climate favorable to the proliferation of episodic violent crime, and vice versa. Episodic violent crime corroding the organization of society from beneath helps create the vacuum into which organized crime enters. So you can easily, and there are many detailed ways in which they communicate with each other and so forth. So that's the basic pathology. So people have ideas about organized crime and combating it and so forth. But in general, they don't have ideas about the other kind of crime. And the other kind of crime is, in fact, much more important. Quantitatively, in its effect on the lives of the majority of the people. So, what will you do about it? You have to find a way of saying, if you're in one of these societies which are disorganized at the grassroots level, do you just accept that? You say that's our fate, or that's the summary of our history or something, where you say that's a variable on which you can act, and how do you act on it then? So you have to imagine that you'll organize neighborhood associations, that those neighborhood associations will collaborate with the police. That's what community policing should mean, but in general doesn't mean. That you may hire, for example, a multitude of unarmed inspectors with communication equipment to register what's happening and to communicate that. And so you create a flurry of a kind of Brownian motion from below of organization of society. And this will mingle, this will intermingle in some way with the provision of public services. So in the slums in some of these countries, this is the case in Brazil, in the poor boroughs and the slums on the periphery of the large cities have two different situations. There's a situation of the unstructured family, which a single mother lives with her children, and she works in the informal economy, struggling to survive and struggling to keep her children alive. And the men rotate as unstable companions among these unstructured families. That's one situation. So that situation is a situation in which the object has to be survival, the object of the family and the object of whoever helps them. So some structure in the community, like these neighborhood associations, has to stand in the place of the family to some extent, or collaborate with the family. And that's the focus. Then there's a minority of the very poor who are in structured families. And they are then able to benefit from the programs of skilling to go to the next level, to enter the labor market and so on. So these are the kinds of details that you would begin to address if you took this up as a project. It's a great project. And it's a project which crosses the divide between right and left. And who could be against it? The only problem with it is that it's insanely difficult. But it appeals. It has very general appeal, right? And that's how this idea of solidarity would come down to earth. And would become the object of a programmatic initiative. And because then it's not just compensatory redistribution, right? It's not just handouts to the poor, because there's skilling in the labor market on one side, but there's this effort to redress the deficit of cohesion on the other side. So that's the program. Any other comments? Now, before leaving this large area, I want to talk for a moment about an unaddressed theme of social and political theory. So, thinking now of the history of European social theory, which is the main theoretical background to the ideas of the progressives in the world, especially Marxism. And there are three problems, or there are two problems, because the third is not a problem which social theory addressed on the whole. There are two problems which have commanded the attention of classical social theory. The problem of subjugation, or domination, or oppression. That was the focus of Marxism. And in general of the theories that exercise influence on the left. And the problem of disunion, the opposite of cohesion. And that was the central obsession of the founding theorists of sociology, like Durkheim and Tönnies, and their contrast of community and society and so forth. And that was the background of centrist and right-wing theory for the most part, not of the left. except insofar as there was a Christian left. Because for the Christians, the problem of solidarity and union was always central and took an institutional form. So, but there was always a problem of what institutional form. So, take as an example the papal encyclicals. So, at the end of the 19th century, with the beginning of the cycle of modern papal encyclicals, the mark is Rerum Novarum, Leo XIII, 1891. And what you have there is a promise of rights. And then part of the duty of the mission of salvation is to bring salvation to society. But no institutional machinery. So this was a prophecy of what would later happen in the constitutions, starting with the Weimar Constitution after the First World War. The modern, so how can democracy be reconciled with class society? And the fundamental question. And there were two responses that were given. One was corporatism, and the other was join the workers and the capitalists, in quotes, in the same guilds or organizations, in which they become partners, suppressing class conflict. This was centrist or conservative corporatism. And the other was promised rights. So those were the two main devices in the 20th century for dealing with the contradiction between democracy and class society. Corporatism and the constitutional entrenchment of social and economic rights. And the constitutionalization of rights continued in the whole 20th century. Almost every country in the world, starting with the Weimar Constitution, began to pack its constitution with rights, except for one country, the United States, because the United States is stuck with one constitution. And so in the United States, instead of inventing new rights, the procedure has been to reinterpret the rights that are there, because in the United States, the way to change the Constitution is to pretend that it means something different from what it was thought to mean before. But but in all the other countries, there's been these promises. So that's the papal encyclicals. Then, in 1931, Pius XI, Quadragesimo Anno. Now the church presents an institutional program. And what is the institutional program? It's conservative corporatism. It's very close to Mussolini, Italian fascism. They should be in these guilds with capitalists and workers, suppressing class conflict to ensure cohesion. And so that was a synthesis of the two 20th century solutions to the contradiction between class and democracy. Rights, constitutional rights, and corporatism together. And corporatism as the instrument for the fulfillment of the rites. They put the two together and said one would be the instrument of the other. The church was manifestly embarrassed by this procedure. Corporatism turned out to be a kind of fake, and it was delegitimized because of its association with fascism. And so now at the end of the 20th century, beginning with the encyclicals of John the 23rd, the situation reverts. Church abandons the institutional machinery for the rites and goes back to the situation of Herod the Bottom, of Leo the 13th. Now it's what it was at the end of the 20th century. It becomes again what it was at the end of the 19th century. So there was an attempt to provide an institutional machinery. It failed, and it goes back to the early thing. It could have been different, right? They could have said, that one didn't work, let's try a better one. But they returned. So this is just to say, so these are the two background problems associated. The problem of domination, and Karl Marx says the only solution to the problem of domination is eventually replace capitalism by another system, socialism. And for the centrists and conservatives, the problem was disunion, and this was what they came up with. I just described it. Rights and corporatism. Now there's a third problem, and that's what I wanted to talk about, because the third problem is unaddressed. And the third problem is even hard to describe. And I want to call it coldness. So Talleyrand said, living through the period of the French Revolution and afterwards, he said, those who have not lived before the revolution do not know the sweetness of life. Now, what was he talking about? He's talking about this phenomenon that in the so-called traditional societies, the aristocratic estate societies of Europe and their counterparts around the world, the characteristic social relationship combined in the same formula: exchange, power or dominion, and affect. So, for example, the ideology of slavery in the United States and in Brazil, the two largest slave societies in the world, were one big happy family. That was the ideology of slavery. And it was sufficiently plausible that it would be repeated and taken seriously by the slave owners. We're one big happy family. So, and the formula was repeated in all the characteristic social relations between men and women, between parents and children, between bosses and underlings, between rulers and subjects. It was always the same thing. The sentimentalization of unequal exchange. So there's an unequal exchange, it's an instrument of power, and it becomes then the screen on which affect is projected. So social life is warmed up. Then the characteristic of the liberal societies is the separation of the three domains that I just described. Power is for politics, for the state. Exchange is for the market, and affect is for the family. they're disaggregated. The formula that explains Talleyrand's view that life was sweet was this combination. Liberal society, life becomes cold. So at the end of the start of the 19th century, Madame de Staël, a Swiss and French writer and thinker, political theorist, spoke about the emergence of new societies, prodigal in meetings, in forms of association, that deprive us of solitude without affording us company. She said, that was a new society. In which there's a solitary coldness. So what is the problem? What I'm calling is this unaddressed problem in social theory, which obviously has implications for politics. The unaddressed problem is this problem of coldness. So is it the case that as we become freer, we necessarily become colder? Or is there some way in which we can become free without becoming cold? That's what I'm calling the problem of coldness. I put coldness in the list, together with oppression or subjugation and disunion. It's the third problem. And I'm not sure who's going to worry about that, because I said the leftists will worry about subjugation. The conservatives will worry about disunion, and who's going to worry about coldness? So that's not a, strictly speaking, a right or left issue, but an issue of a different kind. So to the extent that this penetrates the literature of social theory, it does so very indirectly. For example, in Weber's ideas about charisma, or in Freud's ideas about cathexis. And is this not something of vital importance to men and women today, always, in any society? Do they want to live in coldness? You know, Schopenhauer describes the situation of humanity this way: porcupines. In the cold night, the porcupines, to warm each other, come closer together. And then they prick one another with their spines. And then they move further apart. And they keep going closer and further, uncomfortably, until they settle into this uncomfortable middle distance. That, he says, is the situation of humanity. And it's another way of evoking the same thing that Madame de Staël was describing. So where is the ardor, where is the warmth supposed to come from in these societies? Suppose a society that becomes develops a knowledge economy for the many, and a high energy democracy, develops along this direction. Will it necessarily become cold, or can it be warm? Now, I just want to say that I have a hypothesis about this. I think that the the way the issue is presented in the history of politics and social theory, the warmth is always an emanation of family life, as in the proposition that I stated, the ideology of slavery. We're one big happy family. And I don't think that in a free society, the warmth can be just the emanation of family life. After all, the family is also contested as a form. So where is the warmth going to come from if it doesn't come from that? So the idea is, the traditional idea is in the family there's warmth, if there's not conflict. And a little bit of it escapes the gravitational field of the family and penetrates the surrounding life of culture and society. And even to this day, in these hierarchical societies, which aren't the slave societies of the 19th century, people feel that way about themselves, about their culture. That's how the Brazilians feel, for example, about themselves. They feel we're very unequal, we're poor, we have all these problems, but at least we're not as cold as the Americans. That's how they feel. And to this they attribute their ability to charm. So my conjecture is that we can't think about the warmth this way. That the solution to the problem, the source of the warmth has to be different. I think the source of the warmth is the imagination. What is the imagination? And I've invoked the idea of the imagination at several points in the programmatic argument of the course. The imagination has two moves, right? One is the move that Kant emphasized, the distancing from the phenomenon. To imagine something is not just to look at it, to stare at it. To imagine it, you have to let go of it. You distance it. So an image, the imagination, an image is the memory of a perception, the philosopher said. If you to remember it, you can't actively be perceiving it. But now comes the second move of the imagination, and the second move is decisive. The second move is the subsumption of the phenomenon under a range of accessible variations, by which process you understand the phenomenon. Because to understand the phenomenon is to understand what it can become. If you're just staring at it, you don't understand it. It's a kind of retrospective rationalization, is not understanding. To understand it is to imagine it transformed in the ways in which it can be transformed. Say, if there's such and such interventions, you can make it into something else. It's not the ultimate horizon of what it can become, it's what it can become next. So around each phenomenon, there's a penumbra of accessible possibility, the adjacent possible. It's like a halo surrounding everything. And so you deny some of the brute facticity, the just there-ness of the phenomenon. And you see, it could become this other thing. And this has a great importance in politics, for example, because it has to do with the way in which every group or class can imagine its identity and its interests. The Marxist view is the view that as class conflict escalates, in scope and in intensity, the objective character of every class interest becomes manifest. Every class has an objective interest. And if it's mistaken about its interest, it will, the nature of the interest will become manifest as class conflict intensifies. Now, I think that the truth is just the opposite of this Marxist view. The truth is that the apparent objectivity of class interests or group interests is an illusion, which results from the containment or suppression of conflict. So, for example, if there's no conflict about the transformation of conventional industry into a variant of the knowledge economy, the workers who are stuck in the declining Rust Belt industries imagine that the only thing they can do is to build themselves into their niche, dig themselves into their niche, against all the immediate rivals in the surrounding social and economic space, the small business class, the foreign workers, and so forth. But if they imagined that their Rust Belt industry, their conventional, could be transformed step by step into a variant of the knowledge economy, then they might also think that those groups which they imagine to be rivals and enemies could become their allies. So as conflict intensifies and the question of the alternatives becomes paramount, the question, who am I and what are my interests as a member of a certain class or segment of the labor force, becomes inseparable from the question, what are the adjacent alternatives? And who would I become under those alternatives? It's the opposite. It turns the Marxist view on its head. So the imagination then subsumes the phenomenon under this penumbra of alternatives. And what are these institutional arrangements that I've been discussing in the course of an inclusive knowledge economy or a high energy democracy? They are the institutional instruments and embodiments of the imagination. They're an accelerated creation of alternatives, alternative products and services, alternative forms of the market economy. And high energy democracy is the same thing with an even greater scope or an even higher level. It's a machine for the perpetual creation of the new. So in the list of the problems of modern society, I want to say, that's the unidentified problem. The problem that the social theorists left aside. How can we become both free and warm? How can we become free without becoming cold? And this is something that every human being wants, whether or not he or she says it. So that's what I would add to the list. Now again, I ask you, yes.
Could you talk about, when you talk about coldness, is that or is that not related to the idea of alienation?
Of?
Alienation, and if...
I suppose it is,
The
yes.
advancement of capitalism, because if
Yeah.
you refer to Western societies or Western European societies as cold in general, then there's also some sort of contrast between lesser developed societies, at least on the...
Yeah, so I think, so this very interesting comment, estrangement, alienation, is of course not a concept with a univocal meaning. It has many meanings. Well, one of the meaning is the meaning suggested by romanticism and its defects, right? So, it's, you could interpret alienation this way, it's saying there's a structure, and you have a role in that structure, but you don't feel that when you're performing that role and obeying the structure, you're really you. So you're going through the motions. You're playing the role in which you were cast, but you have this experience, right, that Sartre described as bad faith in performing the role. And that's one definition of alienation. And that makes me think that this problem that I'm trying to describe here is related to the pathology of romanticism. Because after all, what's the romantic idea? Romantic idea is that when is a human being fully human? When are you authentically you? You're authentically you when you're shaking the structures. And the structures lose their grip. And this is, for example, take the attitude of romanticism toward marriage. So, the romantic hero seeks to win the hand of the beloved. And the early romantic novel is a narrative about the adventures of the protagonist in the world in order to win the hand of the beloved, to show that he's worthy and so forth. But in the romantic novel, the marriage itself is never present because the marriage is unimaginable. The routines of married life are an inversion or a denunciation of the romantic dream. And so the marriage, even though the whole object is the marriage can't be described. This is the contradiction of romanticism. So you could say the romantic thinks structures, routine, repetition is the hand of Midas, which turns everything to gold, kills the spirit, is the anti-spirit, right? We're only alive in those moments in which we shake the structure, and those interludes in which there's the mob, the revolutionary mob in the streets, instead of the bureaucratic apparatus, the intense fervor of romantic love rather than the routines of married life, and so on and so forth. The structure will always come back, the romantic understands, because there's no way of avoiding it. And then we'll be dead again. So we'll have these moments of life. So it's a form. So I would say, speaking from this perspective here, which is animated in the arguments of the courts, that romanticism is a form of despair. What it despairs about is any possibility of changing qualitatively the relation between spirit and structure. So what is spirit? Spirit is the character of our experience by virtue of which we exceed every structure. There's always more in us than there is in the context. The context is finite in relation to us, and we are infinite in relation to it. We spill over, and this quality of excess or spillover, of anomaly, of transgression, is what defines us as human. So then the question is, and this is the fateful question, on which many of these arguments here turn, can we change the relation between spirit and structure? Can we create structures that are more hospitable to spirit. So that, and this is one of the senses of freedom, one of the senses of freedom is that we could be in a world and at the same time resist it. That we could engage in a particular context, but deny it the last word. Keep the last word for ourselves. Then we would be free. And so I would say, that's another way of approaching this question of alienation, of estrangement, right? We're estranged when we can't see that possibility, when we don't have that hope. And we're not estranged when we have that hope and we can act on it by working to create structures that are more hospitable to spirit. For example, and then we could say, bringing it down to earth, one way in which they could be more hospitable to spirit is because they're open to a wide range of contradictory experience. And because they facilitate their own revision so that we don't have to feel that in engaging in them, we surrender to them. We can engage without surrendering. We can be insiders and outsiders at the same time. Or as the Christian formula says, we can be in the world without being of it. Is that not what we want? Is that not freedom? So I think that's another way of presenting the problem. And therefore another way of presenting this problem of the third issue in the history of social theory. So thank you. Thank you for that observation. I think it's very acute and it helps. But you're all silent. Yes.
I don't understand why we have to deal with this within systems. Like, I think conservatives would argue that we can develop this empathy just outside.
We can.
So we can develop a similar type of empathy between people or freedom just outside of the systems in the first place.
Outside, but what does outside of a system mean? Is the world a system? I mean, any real society? I mean, that brings up this question of alienation again. So, as we engage in a certain world and perform certain roles, can we communicate with one another in this way? So that the warmth is part of the routine, as it were, rather than being a serendipitous anomaly, a subversive moment in which what is subversive and authentic is always intimately private. I don't know that I would call that conservative. I would say that's part of the romantic orthodoxy. That is the romantic orthodoxy. Kierkegaard, philosopher, said, the war against repetition is a war against life, because life is made of repetition. But the question is there a dialectic between repetition and disruption? And can the nature of the repetition be such as to favor disruption and to create a space for it? So we imagine a structure that is hospitable to spirit. This has religious significance because, after all, and this relates to what I was saying about the papal encyclicals, I think a Christian has to believe that no human being ever has a definitive home in the world. There's no final structure. There's no structure that does justice to us. But the structures differ. Some homes are better than others, although none is the final home. And they differ especially along this dimension. And one of the most important ways in which they differ is by facilitating the recognition of their own finitude, of their own flaws, inviting in this mass of contradictory experience and organizing their own transformation. And so then we would say, going back to the critique of the constitutions, the Weimar Constitution, these insane promises of rights, promising everything to everyone with no mechanism for the implementation of these rights, is that instead of doing that, they should organize the institutional machinery of the market and of the state of democratic politics that would allow us to transform them from within. We don't want the final scheme. We want a practice for this transformation, for perpetual transformation, for the perpetual creation of the new. That would be a much more fundamental change. Now, I think there's, of course, I'll say go back to the discussion of education, because that's the fourth axis of this program. The economy, politics, civil society, and education as the forefront, the creation of the agent, the individual. And it's at the same time a bridge between the discussion of institutions and the discussion of consciousness. As this conversation we just had about coldness is also such a bridge between institutions and consciousness. So the school under democracy, I think some of what I'm going to say is in the line of John Dewey's educational ideas, but some of it is not. In a democracy, what is the school, or who does the school speak for? So there's the family, there's the state, and there's the university. The family says to the young person, become like me. And the idea that the school should be the instrument of the family. Plato, in the Republic, offers the startling proposal that the first thing we should do is take the children away from the family. The opposite, the reversal of this. And it's a problem because the family nourishes the child, and not just materially, but with love. And in principle, this love that nourishes it can be in the service of emancipation. That's what I said when I spoke about the correct way of understanding the relation between the haven and the storm. The parents say to the child, I love you. You have an unconditional place in my love. Now go out and raise a storm in the world. That's the connection, which Plato's proposal fails to do justice to. Then there's the state. The state says to the young person, serve me. Learn how to operate in my world. You'll be a good soldier, a good citizen, and so forth. And the university, speaking through the national curriculums that exist in the world, says to the student, accept my ideas as the way things are. And the school shouldn't be any of these things. Somehow, and this is the paradoxical claim, the school has to be able to operate with these real forces that represent the present, the family, the state, the university, and escape from their gravitational field. Throw one against the other, use one as a way to limit the influence of the other. And who should the school represent that? Now I'm going to say an idea that would sound romantic, and I just condemn romanticism. The school should speak for the future. The school should be the voice of the future, of the possible. That's what the school should be under democracy. Because the students shouldn't be just like puppets of the forces of the present world. So, what's the practical background of such a form of education? I referred to it in an earlier moment in the course. In societies that are large, unequal, and especially federal in structure, you have to reconcile local management of the schools with national standards of investment and quality. So you have to have a way of finding out what works, performance, school by school, student by student. You have to have a mechanism to redistribute resources from poor places to richer places to poor places. And you have to have a procedure of corrective intervention, because if a local school system falls repeatedly beneath the minimum acceptable level of investment or quality, there has to be a way of taking it over, fixing it, and returning it fixed. And in a federation, that might be a trans-federal mechanism associating the three levels of the federation in a collegiate body of some kind with these powers of intervention and reconstruction. And what then should be the pedagogic paradigm, the method of teaching and learning? And we discussed this before, so I'm going to repeat now in the light of these economic and political discussions we have. First, the focus should be on the imaginative capabilities that allow us to imagine, to understand the transformation, analytic and synthetic capabilities. The focus should be to learn how things change, natural phenomena and social phenomena, because to understand anything is to understand its transformation in the realm of the adjacent possible. You can't acquire these capabilities of the imagination in a vacuum of content. You can acquire them only in dealing with content. But with respect to content, what matters is not encyclopedic breadth. What matters, encyclopedic coverage. What matters is selective depth. And that's the case for a style of education that is thematic or project-oriented. Third, there should be a radicalization or a reinterpretation of the idea of a classical education. So you need a third eye. It's not just being educated in the ideas of the contemporary society, but in some distant idea, in some alternative vision, so that there can be this antagonism or dialectic between your vision and the other vision. And the ideal, and this is what they always thought, was a vision that's distant but has some kind of relation to the existing world. Was the Western idea of studying the Greek and Roman classics, or the Chinese idea of study of the Confucianist canon. But of course, the canon should be radically diversified. The problem is the canonical character of the canon. Fourth, the social context of education should be cooperative. Cooperation among students, among teachers, between students and teachers, among schools, in presence and remote, and so forth. Cooperation is the method of advanced science. As opposed to what traditional schooling is, which is the juxtaposition of individualism and authoritarianism. And finally, and most with greatest difficulty, everything should be taught at least twice from contrasting points of view. If we abandon the encyclopedic idea, there's time to teach everything twice. Every method, every discipline. Because that's the only way to liberate the mind. And that's the best way to immunize the young against the servility of the university culture, which is based on forced marriages of method and subject matter, and on the confusion of, and on the hiding of the metaphysical presuppositions of different subjects, confused with their empirical findings, when in fact, all the empirical findings should be reinterpreted when viewed on the basis of different philosophical assumptions. Now, and this is, I've described it with respect to general education, but it also applies to vocational or technical education, because we would repudiate, we would overcome the traditional model of practical education, which is the old German model of training in job-specific and machine-specific skills, and in the traditional trades, plumbing, electricity, and so forth. And the focus would be on the higher order, flexible, manual, and conceptual capabilities required for the continuous use and reprogramming of the numerically controlled machine tools on which the knowledge economy depends. Now, so one of the ways in which transformation can begin in these societies is in education, because some societies in the 20th century, just take the New World, John Dewey in the United States, Jose Vasconcelos in Mexico, Domingo Sarmiento in Argentina, national revolutions, movements of national liberation organized around education. Education as an emancipatory project for the nation, for the construction of the nation. And obviously this is not something that can be organized by a despot, an educational despot, a little Plato, surrounded by his coterie. It has to be done by hundreds of schools, thousands of teachers. It has to be a national movement. Easier said than done, right? And I think that an educational program of this kind comes to life when you see it as being the educational counterpart to a project of institutional change. No, a very succinct statement, the educational project. Would someone like to make a statement about this? So I think of course, the fundamental contradiction, the paradox is, how can the school not be the instrument of the present society? How can it be the instrument of the future? You were going to say something there.
Well, I guess I was just wondering, in the U.S. context, how does the role of private education play into like this revenue system? Because if the point is to like create future thinking individuals, but you still have like this private sector, when it's still like not balanced out.
Yeah, well, this goes to the remarkable educational dualism that exists in some of these societies, like in the United States. There are two radically different systems of education, right? For the mass of public schools, it's education for a world that no longer exists. The world of the Fordist factories, of the bureaucratic offices, a world that's disappearing, right? And it was a degenerate form of encyclopedism with a focus on training in the disposition to obey, to obedience. Unruly children from the working class, teach them to obey, have them obey, and keep them busy in the meantime, right? And then the elite structure, the elite level, this dialogic, analytic problem solving that John Dewey recommended. But rejecting the other part of his program, which is the criticism of contemporary ideas and arrangements. And I said in that earlier class, that was replaced, apparently, by a focus on a different kind of sociability. Do you remember how I described that sociability? I said, the object is to cast a halo of charisma on your fellows, to seduce them, but in a way which you appear not to be doing that, right? A self-concealing charisma, which is judged to be useful or even indispensable to participation in the American professional business class. So that's the object. So you get together and you solve problems collectively, cooperatively, analytically, and then you learn to fund this form of sociability. So this should be seen and denounced for what it is. And you have to have a large vision in order to address these particular monsters. Well, you notice what the basic moral and psychological logic of it. It's like, as I go from class to class, I'm always doubling the bet, right? So instead of making it down, and therefore seem more practical, it's my natural inclination to do the opposite. But I still want to insist that I'm not a romantic. So we'll continue next week.